And I think from our perspective, what we were sort of arguing is that many of the problems with existing academic research on citizenship is that it works with an imaginary citizen, very much a sort of fantasy citizen. And we particularly blaming Habermas here, I think, but not just Habermas. A whole swathe of academic work does this. And there's also an implicit or fantasy social psychology that goes along with that. That's embedded in the notion of deliberation, for example, as something that citizens might be able to do. So a whole set of assumptions about citizens' motivations, their capacities, their ways of acting and their identities and so on. Just to take one example, I think New Labour political discourse is full of these kinds of imaginings of citizens. I think John Clarke said, to me not long ago, that New Labour likes its citizens to be busy, which I thought was a really insightful thing to say, because you get that image in New Labour discourse of the bustling, kind of do-gooder, busy citizen, or that's ideally how we should all be. And so in both political and academic discourse, you find this sort of lurching from the citizen on a pedestal who's deferred to in a rather patronising way to a citizen who's morally castigated, when they don't engage in the right kind of way and behave in the right citizen kind of fashion, and so on. So, no, I'm not arguing that, we want that our research would somehow deal with reality, that theory does imaginary citizens and that our empirical work would actually deal with the actuality of citizens. We think imagination is there and every time a citizen is asked to act as a citizen. But what we want to do is change the focus from the theorists' accounts, particularly political science accounts of what citizens should be doing, what they should be like, to look at citizens' own practice. So what people actually do when they're asked to act in that way. And we had the great good fortune to be asked to evaluate the Citizens' Council that was set up by the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. I'd like to just say that we've got here in the audience Sarah Seymour Smith and Elizabeth Barnett, who are absolute key players in the ethnography that we did of the Citizens' Council, which gave us this really rich sort of insight into actual practice. And from that experience, I think we came away with something which is very different from what the political science view is of citizenship and certainly of deliberation. And maybe we'll come back to that. And I think, Celia perhaps will pick up more about the nature of the Citizens' Council and its kind of context. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, seamless transition to me. We've got a book that's all about citizenship, but only mentions citizens probably on the cover. And somehow we have managed to do that. I think what was really important about this piece of work was the opportunity to do the kinds of things that Margie was talking about. What really happens when people come forward, and they did come forward in very large numbers, to put their hands up and say they wanted to do citizenship in some shape or another. And they didn't have many clues about what that citizenship would be. And the kinds of ethnographic work that Margie led in this book, I think, raises lots of challenges. People are not clean slates on which things can be written. They're influenced by a whole array of things before they get into the arena. But what I would say is that the book is both about what happens on the ground in a very meticulous and detailed way, but it's also trying to put it in a wider context. Mike mentioned democratic renewal. And for me, one of the interesting things about that book is the organisation NICE itself and the kind of reframing of institutions that was going on under New Labour, that moved hard decisions, in this case in the field of health, out from politicians to a seemingly independent agency, which then had to engage with stakeholders of various kinds, and added to that this group of what we called them at one stage unhyphenated citizens, not citizen residents, not citizen service users, but just pure citizens. And they struggled to find what Margie called an expertise space from which they could speak. But as well as that, the organisation itself was struggling. And I think one of the things that I found most interesting and most challenging about working here was to take this concept of a context that constrains and try and rework some of this vocabulary around it. The context is also constructed. There's a lot of sense-making going on I wrote another article later. I called it a dialogic intermediary organisation, trying to get legitimacy for itself and constantly giving accounts of what it was that it was doing. And this council that it set up was very much a movable feast. So I think one of the main contributions that we've got here, alongside looking at the citizens themselves, is the shifting institutional context and the discursive climate in which citizenship is being debated and put into practice. And it's the mixing of those two things, the bringing of them together, I think. We're in transitional times, and we're creating new institutions, new practices, and we've been able to chart one part of that.
Can I follow on from that?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I think our books are puzzling around similar problems, because the nice book, it is a very nice book, studied one deliberative arena in enormous depth, aided by the close attention to discourse and discourse theory that Margie and others brought to the process. The one that I'm partly involved in authoring was a study of 17 deliberative forums, and it came out of an ESRC study. And so they both occupy this kind of territory of the multiplication of spaces where citizenship is enacted, the proliferation of sites of engagement between officials, governments, whatever you want to call them, and the public. And we studied a range of bodies, from health deliberative forums right through to liaison bodies for gay and lesbian communities set up by the police, consultations around gender issues, and quite a lot of local authority-sponsored neighbourhood, place-based deliberative initiatives. So they were very various. And I think what we struggled with in trying to write this variety up was a puzzle. And I think reading some of Margie, Celia and Elizabeth's book, there's a similar kind of puzzle there, which is, does this proliferation, does it represent some kind of new model of the empowered citizen, engaging in lots of new spaces, taking power, having a voice? So is it part of a new framework of collaborative governance, you might call that? Or is it a set of processes through which citizens are captured into new fields of power? So that's really the governance versus governmentality debate. Is it New Labour's vocabulary, or is it Foucault's critique of what that vocabulary might really be meaning? And I think my answer, certainly, and the three of us have different views on this, but I got to write the conclusion, so, is that you have to not close those down. You have to hold both of those perspectives open. And certainly the governmentality perspective is powerful, but it's not enough on its own. The meanings are more open than that governmentality perspective would offer. And the boundaries are more porous. And that porosity of boundaries between institutions and citizens is, I think, one of the most interesting things that came out of the project, because it means that identities are in tension, not only the identities of citizens who are taking on new role as experts or whatever, but also the role of the people working within public sector bodies doing this kind of negotiation, whose identities also work across that boundary in very complicated ways. So that's, I think, what I want to say about the book. But the project was interesting because we call CIG one of its strengths is working across disciplinary boundaries.